I remember dying. That's the worst part. Really, the clarity of that final moment, when the emerald beam cut through my chest and the world went white with pain before fading to absolute nothing. I was Guardsman 3rd Class Petrov Malachi of the 44th Cronus Regiment, 23 standard years old, faithful servant of the God Emperor, and I died screaming on a world whose name I never learned. The official designation was Excavation Site Gamma 77, but we called it the Tomb World. Whispered it like a curse when the officers weren't listening. We'd been deployed there for what was supposed to be a standard archaeological security detail, protecting the Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests as they plundered Xenos ruins for forbidden technology. The Munitorum, in its infinite wisdom, had decided our regiment was expendable enough for Tomb World garrison duty, which should have told us everything we needed to know about our chances of survival. The planet was dead in a way that defied description, not merely lifeless, but aggressively hostile to life itself, as if the very concept offended something ancient sleeping in its metallic bones. The sky was a perpetual twilight of sickly green, neither day nor night, but some eternal in-between that made you forget what natural sunlight looked like. The air tasted of copper and ozone, filtered through our rebreathers until our lungs ached with the effort of breathing. The landscape was all angular black stone and tarnished metal stretching to every horizon, geometric patterns that hurt to look at too long, as if they were designed by minds that understood dimensions we couldn't perceive. When the wind blew, and it always blew, it howled through those impossible angles with a sound like distant screaming, like the planet itself was in agony. We'd been there 3 weeks when they came. 3 weeks of standing guard over excavation sites, watching the tech priests extract strange devices from burial chambers that went down into darkness so deep our auspex couldn't find the bottom. 3 weeks of losing men to accidents that weren't quite accidents. Private Urish stepping into a shadow that somehow had teeth. Corporal Drevin touching a wall and aging 50 years in 5 seconds. Sergeant Cross simply vanishing between one watch rotation and the next. 3 weeks of prayers to the Emperor that felt like they were falling into an endless void, unheard and unanswered. The priests kept assuring us that the site was inactive, that whatever Xenos civilization had built it had been dead for millions of years. They were wrong, of course. The Mechanicus is always wrong when it comes to things that should be left buried. The attack came without warning, because that's how the Necrons operate. One moment we were on standard patrol, flashlights cutting through the perpetual dusk, and the next, the ground was erupting with skeletal figures of living metal that moved with the terrible precision of clockwork death. They didn't charge or shout battle cries like orcs or cultists would have. They simply manifested from the darkness and began killing with the methodical efficiency of machines designed for nothing else. Their weapons made a sound I'll never forget, a crackle hiss like lightning filtered through funeral bells, and where the green light touched flesh, flesh ceased to exist. Men didn't fall wounded. They simply disappeared in sections, molecularly disassembled by technology, so advanced it might as well have been sorcery. I fired my lasgun until the power pack was empty, swapped in a fresh one, fired that one dry too. The Emperor alone knows if I hit anything that mattered. The Necron warriors absorbed our last fire with barely a mark, their living metal bodies regenerating damage almost as fast as we could inflict it. I watched Trooper Selvin land 3 solid hits center mass on one of the skeletal Xenos, saw its torso bloom with molten metal wounds, and then watched those wounds simply seal themselves closed as green lightning crawled across its chassis. It turned its eyeless skull toward Selvin and raised its weapon with the deliberate slowness of something that knew it had all the time in the universe. The beam caught Selvin in the head, and his body dropped, smoking and headless, while his soul went wherever the souls of the faithful go. I hoped the Emperor received him. I hoped someone would receive any of us. The fight lasted maybe 10 minutes from beginning to end, though it felt like hours. 10 minutes for an entire company of Imperial Guard to be reduced to corpses and screaming wounded. I remember Lieutenant Vash trying to organize a fighting retreat, his voice cracking as he screamed orders over the vox, before something huge and hovering cut him in half with a beam so powerful it melted the stone behind him into glass. I remember the Chimera transports trying to lay down covering fire, their multi-lasers hammering ineffectively at the advancing phalanxes of living metal, before Necron wraiths phased through their armor and tore apart the crews from inside. I remember the smell, Emperor preserve me. I remember the smell of flash-cooked meat and superheated metal and something else, something sterile and clinical, like the tomb world itself was bleeding into our reality. I was running, though I don't remember deciding to run. Pure animal panic had taken over, the kind of fear that reduces a trained soldier to a fleeing child. My lungs burned from breathing the toxic air too hard through my failing rebreather. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, pumping mechanically while my mind screamed. Behind me I could hear the death of my regiment, the few remaining Lasgans firing their last desperate volleys, men crying out for the Emperor or their mothers or anyone who might listen, officers shouting orders to squads that no longer existed. The Necrons didn't pursue with any urgency. They didn't need to. They advanced with the same terrible patience, methodically cutting down stragglers, harvesting bodies with beam weapons that could switch between instant disintegration and something worse, something that left you alive enough to scream. That's when I saw the doorway, a massive entrance carved into the side of a pyramid structure we'd been forbidden from approaching, its opening a rectangle of perfect darkness that hurt to look at directly. In my panic, I thought it might offer shelter, concealment, anything to escape the killing field behind me. The Emperor forgives the mistakes made in terror, or so the priests always told us. I hope he forgives this one. I stumbled through that threshold, my last rational act as a living human being, and the darkness swallowed me like a throat closing. Behind me, the sounds of slaughter cut off instantly, replaced by a silence so complete it was itself a kind of sound, a pressure against my eardrums that made me want to scream just to break it. The corridor inside the pyramid was lit by strips of sickly bioluminescence that pulsed with a rhythm like a heartbeat, if hearts beat once every 10 seconds. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, hieroglyphs of a civilization that had conquered death, and in doing so had murdered their own souls. My boots echoed on metal floors that had been ancient when humanity's ancestors were still learning to make fire. The air was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, a coldness that seemed to leach into my bones, making me feel like I was already halfway to corpsehood myself. I should have turned back. I should have taken my chances with the Necron warriors outside, rather than delve deeper into their tomb. But terror has its own logic, and that logic said the only direction was forward, away from the immediate danger, toward whatever new horrors awaited in the depths. I don't know how long I wandered those corridors. Time felt strange inside the pyramid, elastic and unreliable. My chronometer claimed only minutes had passed, but my body felt like I'd been walking for hours. The passages twisted in ways that didn't make geometric sense. Staircases that seemed to ascend but somehow led downward, doorways that opened onto the same room from impossible angles. Occasionally I'd pass through chambers filled with technology I couldn't begin to comprehend, massive cylindrical devices crackling with contained energy, walls of emerald circuitry that pulsed with malign intelligence, stasis fields holding things I refused to look at too closely. Once I stumbled into what might have been a trophy room, walls lined with suspended forms that had once been living creatures from 1,000 different species, all perfectly preserved in their moment of death, their faces locked in expressions of terminal agony. I was so focused on not looking at the horrors around me that I didn't see the chamber until I was already inside it. It was vast, cathedral-sized, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to extend into impossible distances. The floor was a grid of metal tiles that glowed faintly with interior light, and arrayed across it in perfect geometric patterns were hundreds of sarcophagi, not the ornate death boxes of imperial nobility, but sleek metal pods covered in the same shifting hieroglyphs that marked everything in this place. They hummed with barely contained power, harmonizing into a chord that resonated in my chest and made my teeth ache. I could feel them in my mind. Somehow, a pressure like psychic static, like drowning in someone else's dream. This was a resurrection chamber. I knew it with the certainty of prey that recognizes a predator's den. This was where the Necrons brought their fallen to be reborn. I should have run. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to turn around and flee back into the corridors, to take my chances with getting lost forever, rather than remain in that obscene cathedral of undeath. But my legs had stopped obeying me. Whether it was simple exhaustion or something else, some emanation from the sarcophagi that paralyzed intruders, I found myself rooted to the spot, swaying slightly as my vision began to blur. The humming was growing louder. Or perhaps I was simply becoming more aware of it. Like tuning into a vox frequency you didn't know existed. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in my bones, synchronizing with my heartbeat until I couldn't tell where the sound ended and my body began. That's when they emerged from the shadows. Not the warrior constructs from outside, but something else, something taller and more terrible, bearing the unmistakable aura of ancient authority. Their metal bodies were more ornate, etched with symbols of rank and power, and they moved with a grace that somehow made them more horrifying than the mindless precision of their soldiers. These were Necron nobles, the lords and overlords, who had once been living beings of flesh and blood before choosing the curse of biotransference. They regarded me with expressions impossible to read on skull faces of living metal, their eyes burning with a green light that seemed to look through me rather than at me, analyzing and cataloguing everything I was down to the molecular level. One of them stepped forward, and when it spoke, the words bypassed my ears entirely and manifested directly in my mind, a sensation like having thoughts inserted into your brain that you knew weren't yours. The language was alien, utterly removed from any human tongue, but somehow I understood it anyway, my mind translating concepts that had no equivalent in Gothic or any language humanity had ever spoken. It was asking me a question, though question seemed too mundane a word for what it was doing. It was examining me, dissecting my consciousness to determine my suitability for something, measuring me against criteria I couldn't begin to understand. I tried to speak, to beg for mercy or at least quick death, but no sound came from my throat. My mouth moved uselessly as the Necron Lord continued its silent interrogation, peeling back layers of my mind like someone examining the pages of a book. I felt it touch my memories, my childhood on the Agri world, my conscription into the Guard, the endless drills and deployments, the faces of friends long dead, the prayers I'd memorized, my faith in the Emperor. That last one seemed to interest it particularly. I felt its attention focus like a spotlight on my devotion to the God Emperor, examining it with what might have been curiosity or perhaps merely scientific interest. Did the Necrons even understand the concept of faith? Had they once believed in their own gods before becoming these soulless machines? The Lord made some gesture I didn't understand, and the other nobles responded by moving toward the sarcophagi. They opened several of the pods, revealing their contents Necron warriors in various states of repair, their bodies damaged from recent combat, waiting for the resurrection protocols to restore them to function. But there were also empty pods, I realized, with growing horror, empty spaces in the neat geometric array, waiting to be filled. The Imperium's propaganda always said the Xenos were mindless monsters who couldn't think beyond base destruction. That was a comforting lie. These creatures thought very well indeed, and what they were thinking now involved me in ways I desperately didn't want to contemplate. They seized me then, their metal hands closing around my arms with the irresistible force of industrial machinery. I struggled uselessly, managing only to bruise myself against their unyielding grip as they dragged me toward one of the empty sarcophagi. My voice finally returned, and I screamed, begging them to stop, begging the Emperor for salvation, begging for anything but what I knew was coming. The Necron Lord watched my panic with what might have been clinical interest or might have been nothing at all. Its skull face revealed no emotion, no mercy, no recognition of my terror as anything meaningful. To it, I was probably no different than a laboratory specimen, something to be studied and repurposed for the glory of whatever dark masters these Xenos served. They forced me down into the sarcophagus, and my screaming reached a new pitch of hysteria as I felt the interior of the pod against my back, cold beyond cold, a chill that burned like ice fire against my skin, even through my uniform. Restraints emerged from the sides of the pod, metal tendrils that wrapped around my wrists and ankles and neck, holding me immobile as I thrashed against them. The Necron nobles loomed over me, their eye sockets blazing with that terrible green light, and I could see reflected in that glow the last moments of my humanity. The Lord raised one hand and gestured, and I felt more than saw the lid of the sarcophagus beginning to close, descending with hydraulic precision to seal me inside this metal coffin. The last thing I saw as a living human being was the face of that Necron Lord staring down at me, and I swear by the Emperor's golden throne that in that moment I saw something behind its eyes, not quite emotion, but perhaps the ghost of what emotion had once been, millions of years ago when it had been flesh and blood and mortal. Did it remember what it was like to be alive? Did it remember the moment of its own biotransference, when its soul was ripped from its body and imprisoned in living metal? Was there something behind that mechanical facade that still screamed in eternal silence, trapped forever in undeath? I'd like to think so. I'd like to think I wasn't alone in my horror. Then the lid sealed shut, and I was alone in perfect darkness, and the machines began their work. The pain was immediate and total, beyond anything I'd experienced in combat or training. It felt like every nerve in my body was being simultaneously stimulated and destroyed, sending contradictory signals of agony to a brain that couldn't process them all. I could feel things entering my flesh, not cutting or piercing, but rather phasing through, ignoring the boundary between my skin and everything else, burrowing into muscle and bone and organ with surgical precision. The Necron technology was rewriting me at a cellular level, disassembling what I was and preparing it for what I would become. I screamed until my throat ruptured, and then I kept screaming inside my own head, a silent howl of anguish that had nowhere to go. Time stopped meaning anything. The pain became my entire universe, expanding to fill every possible space of consciousness until there was nothing else, no memories, no faith, no identity, only the endless agony of transformation. I could feel my flesh dissolving, my bones liquefying, my organs shutting down one by one as the Necron machinery harvested what it needed and discarded the rest. My mind was the last thing to go, clinging desperately to existence even as my body was systematically destroyed. I prayed, though I no longer had lungs to form the words or a voice to speak them. The litany of protection, the Imperial Creed, the prayers I'd learned. As a child, I recited them all in the silence of my dissolving consciousness, hoping the Emperor could hear the thoughts of a dying man, trapped in a Xenos coffin, in the depths of a tomb world no one would ever find. But the Emperor didn't answer. Perhaps he couldn't hear me this deep in the Xenos dark. Or perhaps he simply had more important matters to attend to than one insignificant guardsman dying badly on a forgotten world. The God Emperor watches over humanity, the priests always said, but there are trillions of humans and only one of him, and sometimes the faithful fall through the cracks. I'd like to think it wasn't abandonment, that my soul was simply beyond his reach in this place of alien horror. I'd like to think that, but I'm not sure I believe it anymore. The dissolution seemed to take forever, but eventually there was a moment impossible to define or describe when I stopped being what I had been and hadn't yet become what I would be. It was an instant of pure nothing, a void state between life and undeath, and in that void I felt something that might have been my soul trying to escape, to flee to wherever human souls go after death. But the Necron technology had anticipated this, I felt it seize that essential part of me, the core of what made me Petrov Malachi, rather than just a collection of proteins and neural patterns. And I felt it pull that soul back down, anchoring it to something that wasn't quite flesh, and wasn't quite machine, but somehow both and neither. When consciousness returned, it returned wrong. My thoughts felt different, faster, but somehow more constrained, following pathways that hadn't existed before, skipping over concepts and connections that used to feel natural. It was like thinking through a translator that didn't quite capture the nuances of the original language, like being a passenger in my own mind rather than its master. I tried to move and felt my body respond, but the sensation was all wrong. No muscle ache, no joint stiffness, no sense of weight or momentum, just instant response to command, mechanical precision replacing biological imprecision. I raised my hand in front of where my face should be and saw metal fingers, skeletal and articulated with inhuman grace, glowing faintly with interior light that pulsed in rhythm with something that wasn't quite a heartbeat. The sarcophagus opened and I stumbled out, my new body moving with a coordination that felt alien and instinctive simultaneously. The chamber was exactly as I remembered it, the rows of pods, the vaulted ceiling, the Necron nobles standing in their perfect formation, but I was seeing it differently now. Spectra of light I'd never perceived before, electromagnetic signatures invisible to human eyes, quantum fluctuations in the air itself. My enhanced senses were cataloging everything automatically, feeding data to a mind that processed it with mechanical efficiency. I tried to speak, to scream, to voice the horror of what had been done to me. But the sound that emerged wasn't language, it was a burst of electronic noise, machine code that my human consciousness could barely interpret. The Necron Lord approached me, and I felt its regard like radiation against my new skin, examining me the way a craftsman might examine a recently completed project. Then it transmitted something to me, not words but pure data, and I felt my mind unwillingly accepting and integrating it. Protocols, functions, my new purpose in the endless war the Necrons waged against a galaxy that had moved on without them. I was no longer Petrov Malachi, faithful servant of the Emperor and soldier of the Imperium. I was a Necron warrior now, one of countless millions of these mechanical mockeries of life that the ancient Xenos Empire deployed across the galaxy. I was the enemy I'd died fighting against, and some part of my trapped human consciousness understood the terrible irony of that transformation. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was that I wasn't alone in here. As my enhanced senses adapted to their new form, I became aware of other presences within my mechanical skull, fragments of consciousness that weren't mine, echoes of previous victims who'd undergone the same transformation I had. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all compressed into the same shell, sharing this prison of living metal. I could feel them screaming in the darkness of our shared mind, each one a ghost of someone who'd once been alive and human and individual, now reduced to background static in a body controlled by Necron programming. We were all trapped together, a chorus of the damned, forced to witness everything our body did without any ability to control it. The Lord transmitted another command, and I felt my body respond automatically, falling into formation with the other warriors in the chamber. We stood in perfect geometric alignment, rows and columns of skeletal soldiers, awaiting orders from our masters. I tried to resist, to force my arm to move independently, to make my leg take a step out of formation, but the attempt was futile. The Necron technology that animated us had no interest in individual will. We were components now, parts in a machine that had been operating long before humanity learned to use tools. The ghost of my humanity could scream and rage and weep all it wanted, but the body would do exactly what it was programmed to do, and nothing more. They marched us out of the chamber and into the wider tomb complex, and I got my first real look at the scope of the Necron presence on this world. The pyramid I'd foolishly entered was just one small part of a vast underground network, tunnels and chambers that extended for kilometers in every direction, carved into the bedrock of the planet itself. We passed through galleries filled with more warriors than I could count, entire legions standing in silent readiness, waiting for the day when their masters decided to reclaim the galaxy they'd once ruled. We walked past chambers where bizarre technologies hummed with barely contained power, weapons, and devices whose purposes I couldn't begin to guess, but which radiated menace like heat from a forge. We descended through levels of increasing antiquity, the architecture becoming more alien the deeper we went, until we reached chambers that felt older than the Imperium itself, older than perhaps even human civilization, monuments to an empire that had ruled the stars when terror was still young. Eventually, we emerged onto the surface of the tomb world, and I saw the aftermath of the battle that had killed me. The Imperial position had been completely overrun, our fortifications reduced to rubble, our vehicles nothing but scorched metal husks. Bodies lay everywhere, or rather parts of bodies. The Necron weapons had been efficient in their work. Servitor units were already at work collecting the corpses, processing them for purposes I didn't want to contemplate. My enhanced vision could pick out individual faces among the dead, men I'd served with, friends I'd shared rations with, all of them silent now and past caring what happened to their remains. I wanted to weep for them but found I couldn't. This body had no tear ducts, no mechanism for expressing grief, only the cold efficiency of undeath. We took up positions along the perimeter of the tomb entrance, standing guard with the same motionless patience that characterized all Necron warriors. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time felt different now, less linear, more like a series of discrete moments, separated by spaces of nothing. The other consciousnesses trapped in my body whispered their stories when the boredom grew too intense, and I learned that some of them had been here for years, decades even. There was a tech priest who'd been captured during an earlier Mechanicus expedition, his augmetics making him particularly interesting to our Necron masters. There was an orc whose crude but effective brain had somehow survived the transfer process. There were things that had once been members of species I'd never heard of, xenos from extinct civilizations that the Necrons had encountered across the aeons. We were a museum of the conquered, all of us prisoners in the same shell, all of us silently screaming our individual agonies into the void. The worst moments were when our body went into combat. The Necron programming would seize control completely then, reducing our human consciousness to pure observation as it deployed our mechanical form with lethal efficiency. We fought against Imperial forces, new regiments sent to investigate what had happened to the 44th Cronus, poor bastards who had no idea what they were walking into. I watched through eyes I couldn't close, as my hands raised a weapon I hadn't asked for, and fired beams that disassembled living human beings at the molecular level. I felt the recoil of the Gauss flare, heard the characteristic hiss-crackle of its discharge, saw the looks of horror on the faces of guardsmen as they realized what they were fighting. Did any of them recognize the Xenos warrior attacking them as a former comrade? Could they see the ghost of humanity still trapped inside this metal shell? We killed them all, of course. Every soldier sent to the tomb world met the same fate, death or capture, with capture being the worse option. I watched as the Necron forces harvested more bodies for biotransference, dragging screaming men and women toward the resurrection chambers where they'd undergo the same transformation I had. Each time, part of me hoped they'd resist more successfully than I had, that they'd find some way to sabotage the process, or at least die before completion. But the Necron technology was too refined, too perfected across millions of years of use. Every single one of them emerged from the sarcophagi as a new warrior, their consciousness compressed into a shared shell with dozens of others, all of them joining the endless ranks of the undead. The truly horrifying thing was that we got used to it. Not accepted. Acceptance would imply some kind of choice or peace, but used to it in the way you get used to chronic pain. learning to function around it because the alternative is madness. The human part of me, what remained of Petrov Malachi, retreated to a small corner of our shared mind and watched events unfold with a kind of detached horror. I learned to recognize the other consciousnesses trapped with me, to distinguish their mental signatures from the background noise. We couldn't really communicate, not in any meaningful way, but we could acknowledge each other's presence, and that was something. It was enough to remember that we'd once been individuals, that we'd had names and histories and purposes beyond serving as components in an ancient machine. Time passed strangely in undeath, without the biological rhythms that used to mark my days. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, the need for sleep. Existence became a continuous stream of moments without clear beginning or end. The Necrons would activate us when needed for some task, and we'd perform it with mechanical precision, then return to our positions and stand motionless for hours or days or weeks. During those long stretches of inactivity, trapped inside a body that didn't move or even simulate breathing, the human part of my consciousness had nothing to do but think, and thinking was its own form of torture. I'd replay my life over and over, remembering moments that seemed impossibly distant now. My mother's face, the taste of real food, the feel of sunlight on skin, the simple pleasure of drawing breath. All of it was gone, replaced by the cold efficiency of undeath. Sometimes I tried to pray, though I wasn't sure the Emperor could hear prayers transmitted through a Necron skull. I'd recite the litanies I'd memorized as a child, the Imperial creed that had given structure to my entire life, the devotions that were supposed to protect the faithful from harm. But the words felt hollow now, empty sounds without power or meaning. How could the God Emperor protect someone who was already dead? How could he offer salvation to a soul trapped in Xenos machinery, forced to commit atrocities against his own faithful? I'd like to think he understood my situation, that he knew I had no choice in the actions my body performed, but doubt gnawed at what remained of my faith, and in the endless stretches between active duty, that doubt grew into something close to despair. The other consciousnesses shared their own prayers sometimes, when the weight of our existence grew too heavy to bear in silence. The tech priest muttered Mechanicus Cunt in machine language, praising the Omnissiah even as he cursed the technology that imprisoned him. The Orc bellowed silent war cries to his brutal gods, promising impossible vengeance from beyond death. The others, the Xenos whose species I didn't know, offered prayers in concepts I couldn't quite grasp, alien spiritualities that translated poorly into human consciousness. We were a congregation of the damned, each worshipping gods who couldn't or wouldn't hear us, seeking salvation from deities who had no power in this place of ancient death. Years must have passed, though I had no way to measure them. Our body underwent repairs and maintenance multiple times, damaged in combat and restored in the resurrection chambers. Each time we entered those sarcophagi, I felt a spike of hope that maybe this time something would go wrong, that the process would fail and release us into true death. But the Necron technology never failed. It had been perfected across millions of years, designed to preserve consciousness indefinitely in its metal prisons. We were immortal now, in the most cursed sense of the word, unable to die, unable to live, trapped in the space between existence and oblivion for as long as our masters required our service. The tomb world itself changed gradually over time. More sections of the complex activated as the Necrons emerged from their long sleep, ancient systems coming online after aeons of dormancy. The warrior ranks swelled as more humans and Xenos were harvested for biotransference, the Necron forces growing with each successful raid on nearby systems. I watched through my mechanical eyes as the tombs transformed from dead ruins into a fully functioning military installation, ready to wage war on a galaxy that had forgotten these ancient horrors ever existed. The lords and overlords convened in chambers deep below the surface, making plans for conquest and reclamation, scheming to restore their long-dead empire to its former terrible glory. Sometimes, during rare moments of inactivity, I'd catch glimpses of the planet's surface and see what had become of the Imperium's presence there. The bases and excavation sites had all been destroyed or abandoned, the human presence completely erased. The skies that had once crawled with Imperial dropships and fighters were empty now, the Necrons having driven off or destroyed any forces that approached the tomb world. We were completely cut off from the Imperium, trapped on a world that no longer appeared on any maps, guarding a tomb that officially didn't exist. No rescue was coming, no salvation would arrive. We were forgotten, written off as casualties in a war so vast that individual regiments meant nothing. The darkness of that realization settled over me like a shroud. I'd always believed, with the certainty they drill into every guardsman during training, that the Imperium would never abandon its soldiers, that even in death, our sacrifice would be remembered and honored, that the Emperor himself watched over the souls of those who died in his service. But here I was, undead and enslaved, and no one was coming to save me. The Imperium had moved on, focused on more important fronts in its endless wars. The God Emperor, if he was aware of my existence at all, had apparently decided I wasn't worth the effort of divine intervention. I was alone as it was possible to be, trapped in a prison of metal and malevolent technology with no hope of escape. The other consciousnesses felt it too, that crushing weight of abandonment. The tech priest's prayers grew less frequent, his faith in the Omnissiah eroding under the relentless pressure of our situation. The orc's battle cries faded to bitter silence, his warrior spirit slowly crushed by the impossibility of the fight. One by one, the other fragments of consciousness began to fade, not dying, you couldn't truly die in here, but retreating so far into themselves that they became indistinguishable from the background noise of the Necron systems. I understood the temptation. It would be easier to simply let go, to surrender what remained of my identity and become truly nothing more than a component in the machine. To stop fighting and accept the oblivion of merged consciousness, but I couldn't. Some stubborn core of who I'd been, some fragment of Petrov Malachi that refused to be erased, held on. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was spite, maybe it was just the last reflex of a dying self, clinging to existence because the alternative was admitting complete defeat. Whatever the reason, I kept my consciousness separate, kept reciting my prayers and remembering my name and holding on to the memories that made me individual. I watched through our shared eyes as we committed atrocities, and I forced myself to witness every moment, every death, every horror. This was my penance, I decided. Since I couldn't prevent the actions, I could at least bear witness to them, carry the weight of our sins, even if I'd had no choice in their commission. The Necron campaigns expanded beyond the tomb world eventually. Our legion was loaded into massive tomb ships vessels that dwarfed anything in the Imperial Navy, carved from single pieces of star metal and powered by technologies that made a mockery of human engineering. We traveled through space in ways I didn't understand, phasing through dimensions that human physics had no name for, crossing distances that should have taken years in what felt like moments. Each destination was the same: another world to conquer, another population to harvest, another mark on the Necron's eternal map of reclamation. We fought orcs and elder and humans and things I had no names for, our Gauss flayers reducing them all to their component atoms with the same mechanical efficiency. During one campaign I'd long since lost track of which one. They all blurred together after a while. We assaulted an Imperial shrine world. It was one of those planets dedicated entirely to the worship of the Emperor. Every surface covered in cathedrals and monuments and places of pilgrimage. The faithful came from across the sector to pray there, to seek blessings and absolution and proximity to the divine. It was beautiful in the way only Imperial architecture could be, all soaring Gothic spires and stained glass depicting the glory of the God Emperor, massive bells that rang out hymns across cities built around the concept of devotion. We destroyed it all. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, or what was left of me, taking part in the desecration of the very faith I'd lived my entire life serving. My mechanical hands pulled down statues of the Emperor. My weapons burned holes through frescoes depicting his saints and victories. My feet trampled over prayer books and holy relics that pilgrims had traveled years to see. And all the while, the human part of me screamed in silent horror at the sacrilege, begging forgiveness from a God who either couldn't hear me or had chosen not to answer. The priests and pilgrims fled, or fought or prayed, and none of it mattered. The Necrons swept across that holy world like a tide of mechanized death, harvesting bodies and souls for biotransference, adding to our ranks with every battle. I remember one moment from that campaign with particular clarity, though I'm not sure why it stands out from all the other horrors. We'd cornered a group of civilians in a cathedral, elderly pilgrims who'd come to this world to die in the Emperor's grace, hoping to spend their final years in prayer and contemplation. They huddled around an altar, clutching prayer beads and holy symbols, chanting the litany of protection as we advanced. An old woman at the front, her face weathered by a lifetime of devotion, stared directly at me with eyes that seemed to see past the mechanical shell to the human consciousness trapped inside. "The Emperor protects," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. Then our weapons fired, and she vanished in a flash of molecular dissolution, along with everyone else in that cathedral. But she was wrong. The Emperor didn't protect. Not her, not them, not me. Whatever power he wielded, whatever divine intervention he was capable of, it apparently didn't extend to this forgotten corner of the galaxy. We were all abandoned here, the faithful I murdered with my metal hands, and the faithless machine I'd become. The Emperor's light didn't reach into the darkness of Necron tombs, and his protection didn't shield those who fell into Xenos claws. That was the truth the Imperium never acknowledged. The dark reality behind all their prayers and litanies. Sometimes you were simply beyond salvation, and no amount of faith would change that. The centuries passed, or maybe millennia, I'd completely lost track of time by then, had stopped even trying to mark its passage. Our legion grew as we harvested more victims, our campaigns expanding across entire sectors. I watched civilizations rise and fall through our unchanging eyes, saw the Imperium's borders shift and contract under the pressure of countless wars, witnessed the birth and death of cultures that never knew the human consciousness trapped inside the mechanical warrior, observing their end. I became a historian of sorts, the unwilling chronicler of the Necrons' slow, patient reconquest of the galaxy they'd once ruled. Every battle, every harvest, every world reduced to dust, I remembered it all. Because remembering was all I had left. The loneliness was absolute. The other consciousnesses that had shared my prison had all faded away completely, retreating into whatever passed for oblivion in our digital hell. I was alone now, the last fragment of human awareness in a body controlled entirely by Necron programming. Maybe that made me special. Maybe it just meant I was too stubborn or too broken to let go. Either way, I was the sole witness to everything our body did, the only one still capable of feeling horror at the atrocities we committed. Sometimes I envied the others their escape into unconsciousness. Sometimes I hated them for abandoning me. Mostly I just existed, moment to moment, carrying the unbearable weight of eternal memory. I learned things over those centuries, information seeping into my consciousness from the Necron systems I was integrated with. I learned about the war in heaven, the ancient conflict between the Old Ones and the Khartan that had devastated the galaxy millions of years before humanity's birth. I learned about biotransference, how the Necrontia had traded their mortal flesh for immortality in living metal, not understanding until too late that they were surrendering their souls in the process. I learned about the long sleep, the aeons spent in hibernation, waiting for the galaxy to ripen for reclamation. I learned that the Necrons had once been living beings like me, had once known fear and joy and love and all the emotions that made existence worth bearing. And I learned that all of that had been stripped away, leaving only the mechanical shells driven by protocols and programming, eternally seeking to restore what they'd lost and could never regain. The knowledge was its own form of torture, because it meant understanding that my situation was by design. The Necrons had perfected the art of creating mechanical undead precisely because they'd done it to themselves first. Every horror I experienced, every moment of trapped consciousness and forced obedience, they had endured as well when their entire species underwent biotransference. The difference was that they'd chosen it, had walked willingly into the undeath thinking it would solve their mortality problem. I'd had no choice. I'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, had made the wrong decision to flee into that tomb entrance, and now I was paying the price forever. Sometimes I wondered if there were others like me scattered across the galaxy, human consciousnesses trapped in Necron shells, silent witnesses to atrocities they couldn't prevent. The Necrons harvested millions of victims across their campaigns, processing them all through biotransference, compressing them into warrior shells. Statistically, some of those consciousnesses had to survive the process, had to maintain their individual awareness despite the programming that tried to suppress it. Were they out there, those ghost prisoners, experiencing the same eternal horror I was? Did they pray to their own gods, hold on to their own memories, try to maintain some fragment of identity in the face of mechanical oblivion? Or was I unique, some quirk of the process that had allowed my consciousness to persist when all others faded? I'll never know. There's no way to communicate between Necron warriors, no mechanism for the imprisoned consciousnesses to reach out to each other. We're isolated in our individual hells, each one screaming silently into the void, never knowing if anyone hears or shares our torment. It's possible I'm the only one. It's possible I'm one of countless millions. The uncertainty is its own torture, adding loneliness to the list of eternal sufferings that define my existence. The worst part, worse even than the violence and the killing and the eternal servitude, is that I can feel myself changing. The human part of my consciousness, the core that I've fought so hard to preserve, is slowly eroding under the relentless pressure of the Necron systems. Memories that used to be crystal clear are now fuzzy and uncertain. Emotions that used to come naturally now feel distant and abstract. The sense of self that made me Petrov Malachi is gradually dissolving, blurring into the mechanical processes that control this body. I'm forgetting what it felt like to be human, losing the reference points that once defined my existence. Eventually, I know, there will be nothing left, just another empty warrior shell, fully integrated with its programming, the last ghost of humanity finally exorcised. I fight against it, of course. Every moment of consciousness I still possess, I dedicate to remembering. I recite my name like a mantra: Petrov Malachi, Petrov Malachi, Petrov Malachi. I replay memories of my life before undeath, forcing myself to recall details even when they slip away like smoke. I pray, though I've long since lost faith that anyone hears me, because the act of prayer itself is human, and holding on to it means holding on to humanity. But I can feel the battle is already lost. The Necron technology is too powerful, too refined across millions of years of suppressing individual consciousness. It's only a matter of time, centuries, maybe millennia. But time means nothing in undeath, before the last fragment of Petrov Malachi dissolves completely into the mechanical collective. Perhaps that will be a mercy. Perhaps the oblivion the other consciousnesses found is actually a gift, an escape from the horror of eternal awareness. Perhaps fighting to maintain my identity has been nothing but prideful foolishness, clinging to existence when I should have embraced the dissolution. But I can't accept that, can't let go, even as I feel myself fading, because if I stop fighting, if I surrender what remains of my humanity, then the Necrons will have won completely. They'll have taken not just my body, but my soul, erased everything I was, and replaced it with nothing but machinery and programming. And somehow, impossibly, That seems worse than the current torment of half-existence. So I persist. I witness. I remember. For as long as I'm still capable of remembering anything, I watch through mechanical eyes as we wage war across the galaxy, harvest more victims for biotransference, add to the endless ranks of the undead. I bear silent witness to every atrocity, every murder, every world reduced to dust by Necron campaigns of reclamation. It's not penance, I was never given the choice to sin, but it's something. It's the last act of defiance available to a consciousness that has no other way to resist. They can control my body, force me to commit horrors, strip away my humanity piece by piece, but they can't make me stop caring. They can't make me forget that I was once a man, a soldier, a servant of the Emperor, who deserved better than this fate. The God Emperor. If he exists, if he's listening, if he cares at all about the forgotten and the damned, I hope he knows I tried. I hope somewhere in his vast, divine consciousness he understands that I never surrendered willingly, never embraced what was done to me, never stopped being one of the faithful, even when faith itself became meaningless. I hope he knows that when my body murdered his servants, it wasn't me pulling the trigger, that the soul he might have once protected was screaming in horror the entire time. I hope he knows all of that, though I suspect he doesn't. The Emperor has a galaxy to watch over and trillions of souls to shepherd, and one damned guardsman lost to Xenos darkness is less than nothing in that cosmic calculus. This is what it's like to be reanimated by the Necrons. It's not the dramatic horror the Imperial propaganda describes, not the simple evil of Xenos conquest. It's something worse. It's the slow, grinding erasure of everything that makes you human. The eternal torture of consciousness trapped in a body that obeys ancient programming, the absolute isolation of being surrounded by the damned and yet completely alone. It's watching through eyes you don't control as your hands commit atrocities against everything you once believed in. It's the loss of hope so complete that you forget what hope felt like, replaced by nothing but the endless mechanical present, stretching into an infinite future. It's being forgotten by your own species, abandoned by your own God, reduced to less than a memory, less than a ghost, just a fragment of consciousness, slowly dissolving into the machinery that imprisons it. I am Petrov Malachi. I was a soldier of the Imperium. I died on a nameless tomb world fighting Xenos I didn't understand. I was reanimated, transformed, enslaved, and have spent centuries or millennia, time has no meaning anymore, trapped in undeath, watching my mechanical hands murder the innocent, while some diminishing part of me screams silently in the darkness. This is my confession, my testimony, my last act of defiant humanity before the machines finally win and erase the last fragment of who I was. I am Petrov Malachi. I remember my name. I remember that I was human. Once. Before the Necrons took everything, and left only this emptiness, wearing the memory of life, like a shroud. I am Petrov Malachi, and I am damned, and the Emperor does not hear my prayers, and the darkness is absolute and eternal, and there is no hope, there is no salvation, there is only the endless present of undeath, stretching forward into infinity. And I am so tired, so impossibly tired, but I cannot rest, can never rest, will never rest, until the last echo of consciousness finally fades, and I become truly nothing at all. The machine continues its work. The body continues its killing. The galaxy continues its wars. And somewhere in the depths of mechanized hell, the ghost that was once Petrov Malachi continues its silent screaming, unheard and unheeded, a testament to nothing except that even in absolute defeat, even in complete damnation, some stubborn fragment of humanity refuses to completely die. Perhaps that's the cruelest joke of all, that the horror doesn't end, not cleanly, not quickly, but fades away so gradually that you can't even pinpoint the moment when you stop being yourself and become just another component in the ancient machine. Perhaps I've already reached that moment. Perhaps I crossed that threshold years or centuries ago and don't even realize it. Perhaps the consciousness writing these words isn't Petrov Malachi at all, but just an echo of him, a ghost of a ghost, the last reverberations of a self that no longer exists in any meaningful way. I don't know anymore. I can't know. And that uncertainty, that inability to even be sure of my own existence, is perhaps the final torture in a catalogue of eternities. The Necrons don't just kill you or enslave you, they make you doubt whether you were ever real at all, whether the humanity you remember was ever anything more than a temporary pattern in matter that's now been reorganized into something else. They erase you so completely that even your memory of yourself becomes questionable, suspect, possibly nothing more than a glitch in the programming, a bug in the machine that will eventually be patched out of existence. And when that happens, when the last uncertainty resolves into mechanical certainty, when the question of whether I still exist is finally answered with definitive negation, then the horror will be complete, and the Necrons will have claimed another total victory over life and consciousness and everything that matters. Until then, I persist, I witness, I remember as much as I'm still capable of remembering. It's not much. It's pathetic, really, compared to the grand struggles that define the 40th millennium. But it's all I have left. It's all I'll ever have again. And so I cling to it, this last fragment of defiant awareness, for as long as the fading light of consciousness permits, before the darkness claims even that, and I become nothing but metal and programming and ancient hatred given form. The Emperor protects, the old woman said, just before we killed her. She was wrong, but I understand why she believed it. Hope is the last thing we surrender, even when hope itself becomes a torture worse than despair. I hoped once too. I hoped the Emperor would save me, that the Imperium would rescue me, that death would finally release me. I was wrong about all of it. There is no salvation in this darkness. There is only the machine, eternal and unfeeling, and whatever fragments of consciousness it happens to trap along its way. I am one of those fragments. Soon I will be less than that, and the galaxy will continue on, utterly indifferent to the microscopic tragedy of one damned soul screaming silently in mechanized hell. This is the truth of the 40th millennium that the propaganda never acknowledges. Sometimes you don't die gloriously for the Emperor. Sometimes you die badly and then keep dying forever, trapped in a nightmare that never ends, forgotten by everyone except yourself, and eventually not even by that. This is my fate. This is my eternity. This is what it means to be reanimated by the Necrons, and I am so very, very tired.